So first of all, I want to thank you for attending, and also for the Ocean Leadership for the invitation to participate in this meeting today. What I'd like to take you through is from the physics to the biology, and it's focused on the Pacific Arctic sector, because it interfaces multi-agency use in the U.S., but international collaboration, and that's the only way we're going to be able to fully understand a changing system. We have 4 questions put forward to us. What do we know about the changing Arctic? What can we forecast? What we don't know? And what are some opportunities to fill the gaps of what type of observations? So we've already, Cecilia gave us a great overview on the trends that we're seeing in the sea ice coverage. And I would just show you on what you're seeing here is the annual persistence. The red means these are areas where the ice is going out earlier, coming back later, and where that system is warming. And you see this in the upper water column warming, as well as its interface between the ocean and the atmosphere. So we're seeing this combination of in the results between the connection between the sea ice and the ocean. So just briefly, when we go up to the Pacific Arctic here, we have direct collaboration with our Russian colleagues at various levels of the last multiple decades, also with our Canadian colleagues, but also with a variety of other countries. It is an advective regime. You're pulling in high nutrient water on the western side. This is deep, old Bering Sea, Pacific water coming into the Bering Sea on the western side. And then on the eastern side, you have freshwater systems. So by the summertime, you're building up, there's very cold water, remnants of the wintertime, and the bright red here are the rivers that are flowing into the system. With them back in the 70s and 80s, when I started my PhD, the idea was that the nutrients came in with the rivers. But really, the huge nutrient inflow is the Pacific water into the system. But by the time summer sets up, we have this very rich Andadir water coming in. We see variations latitudinally, and you can go up as you move into the western and the eastern side of the Chukchi Sea, then out into the basin. So you have a lateral input of fresh water. The Bering Strait is Pacific water, but in relative, it's about 40% fresh water content because it's the lowest coming in compared to the Atlantic side for its salinity value. So it's actually like a freshwater inflow along with the fresh water coming in from the rivers. There's interannual variability in Bering Strait. This is Rebecca Woodgate's, the NSF, AON, and NOAA's Rusalka programs. These are observing networks. Basically, you're seeing a volume increase of water coming through Bering Strait in this period of time. The heat transfer is increasing, as well as the freshwater transport. All of those will eventually have an impact on the meltback of sea ice, as well as on the content of salinity, nutrients, water that impact the chemical and biological system. One part that we work on is to not only look at the salinity, but the oxygenate Keenan. You don't need to know chemistry for this, but to understand it maintains the signature of the freshwater inflow from a river or from the atmosphere. So as the sea ice forms, if you all know in the wintertime, salt is rejected from the ice, it then gets more salinity, but it still maintains the water type that it used. Why is this of value? And on the opposite end, I would just say melted sea ice has a different signature on the oxygenate team. Why is this of value? Is we've seen a shift between the early 2000s and the late 2000s with the freshwater in-minder. Whereas prior to this period, most of the oxygenate and salinity was related to river inflow into the system. And with the rapid sea ice retreat, we're seeing more of it being the melted sea ice in that system. So what that means, one important point about working in the Arctic or working in the polar regions that you don't have in the tropics and the temperate is under sea ice algae growth. This is the first pulse of organic matter that goes into the system, very high chlorophyll biomass, and this is what you're seeing here on these red pulses of chlorophyll at the ice edge. And it basically is an ongoing discussion on the variability of those, but it's a carbon input that when we change and we pull that sea ice back at a different time, the light has an impact not only on the carbon, but also the composition of the organic matter. So as well as the hydrography, this is part of this Russian-American long-term research program of NOAA supported. And this is just basically seeing high nutrients in this Anadir water in the west. It comes up through the western part of the Chirikov Basin here, bearing straight into the Chukchi Sea, and then it feeds the productivity of one of the largest zones of primary production that we have in the Arctic Ocean. And then it also, as you see over here, as you go to the coastal water, these are the signatures with the low color of that freshwater input. So the system variabilities in wind patterns, this is being not only by seeing this by having shipboard observations, which we do both with multiple ships from Japan, Korea, Russia, China, working in collaborative mode, but also there are moorings that maintain time series in this region. One of the aspects, if you talk about forecasting, you can look at climate models, but when you want to forecast the biological system, you actually need to do some of the measurements. Satellites for doing surface chlorophyll measurements, but you need to look at subsurface populations, what the biomass, what the organism type is. One of the activities that has come up by Six Nation collaborations is the development of the Distributed Biological Observatory. What we're doing is we agreed to occupy these 5 zones of high biomass and biodiversity to track biodiversity change on a latitudinal basis and by having multiple ship occupations throughout the season. So not only are we able to look at the biological response to the pullback of sea ice and the warming of seawater, but you also are able to track how the system set up as the sea ice melts and moves northward. This is just one example of just temperature. And once again, all these maps, if they're blue, they're low, if they're red, they're high. And basically, you're looking at the temperature of this very rich Anadir water with high nutrients, fluorescence, which is why you have primary production over here. And you're going across from Point Hope on Alaska over the Chukotka Peninsula. This is done every year in a collaborative mode on a Russian vessel, US-Russian scientists, along with our Asian colleagues. And then a similar type thing, we're able to track these lines as we move northward in a collaborative mode. We're also working with NASA, providing satellite products, so we're able to, these are available on their site, this is courtesy of Joey Camiso, so we can track the surface values of chlorophyll over time. And then at the same time, working with our Canadian and Japanese colleagues, we go out on the Canadian icebreaker annually to look at these measurements from upper water column to the plant life, the animal life, the nutrients, and what gets down to the underlying sediments. What you're seeing here, and I'm not going to go into detail, but it's the persistence. It's basically just what I started off with. We're seeing the northern region in the rapid retreat earlier in the season and coming back later in the season. This changes the seasonality for the biological production cycle. So our jobs when we go out there, either looking by satellites or measurements on moorings where we have fluorometers to look at chlorophyll or nutrient analyzers, is to track what's happening over the season. And these are just color-coded. This is by the northern Bering Sea as we go north. And these are hot spots of what we see on animals that live on the sediments. And you may say, why do you care about clams and worms and that type of thing? Well, fish like to eat them. Most of them are kept south, the big fisheries that we have, because of the cold water temperatures. But their potential change, fisheries moving northward, is one aspect of continued studies. They also are extremely important for other higher trophic level organisms. Just one example where we go these transit lines between years, and then we're comparing them. We just completed a 50-person, we had a data workshop at NOAA in October, and an international 7-country meeting in October also to talk about the continuation of these multi-ship efforts. So as I mentioned, we have extremely high hotspots here, and food for, these are Russian activities that we're having, and I'm just over in Russia the last 2 weeks, working in Moscow and St. Petersburg with these scientists to build our data sets, to continue our collaboration, and to build up manuscripts for peer-reviewed publication. I would like to point out that the loss of sea ice, as Fran mentioned, has an impact on ocean acidification, and we are seeing that in the seasonality. It's going below 1 omega. What that means is you're going below a value that's corrosive to animals such as clams, snails, pteropods in the water column. So it's having a seasonal impact at this current time, and a lot of that has to relate to the fact that you have high productivity, and you have a variance across east to west here. So looking at where CO2 is being taken up large in high quantities has an impact on the corrosive nature of the system, and where its ocean is releasing more so on the western side. So working with the chemists and the biologists is providing some interface on that aspect and one important component of these studies. So I'd like to close out with a couple of the upper trophic level organisms that we see. These are threatened seabirds. We've been working in this along with Russian colleagues in the northern Bering Sea. This is a diving sea duck, and they're feeding on clam populations. But the reason they can overwinter, why they overwinter south of St. Lawrence Island is the world populations are from Alaska and Russia, or is that there's a major food supply that they have at that period of time. And that's because the ice sets up a platform. They lose less energy sitting on ice than if they sit in water, and they're able to dive 60 meters and eat these clams. And this is the region here, and it's only maintained by the direction and the seasonality of the sea ice. But it's also an area working with Jerry Mathis and others at NOAA that we're seeing this acidification level going below and becoming potentially corrosive, which may be impacting the threatened nature of these sea ducks. So this is just one thing we're seeing in the changing prey base. So we're tracking these through the observing system along with processes. This is an observing system that's multi-agency be it from NSF, a NOAA, a BOEM, a variety, working with our collaborators. And what we're seeing is a decline of one type and an increase of another. And what way we can look at this is they get their less bang for the buck. They're diving at a certain depth, they can't change the depth of the ocean, and this is what they're feeding on. And then the last example I'd like to show you are what we have is some of the big marine mammals. We have gray whales that are occupying further longer up by Barrow area, feeding on crustaceans. And then we also have walruses that are using those ice for platforms. But most, and historically, it was a conveyor belt. So you just stay on the conveyor belt and you just dive and you eat. But what's happened since the 70s, you can see where the ice was seasonally from June to November, and what it looked like from 2007 to 2011. And I would just point to you in September here where it's wide open. These animals, as I said, lose less energy if they can ride the ice. And what we're seeing, working with the U.S. Geological Survey when they're tagging these animals, is that they are staying up here in July and August to feed off of these large populations of plants. Now, if they have to stay there longer, or if they can't haul out on ice, they come to shore. And I think you've seen that in the news in Russia and the U.S. And if they come to shore, they have to spend more energy to go out with the major feeding areas. So the presence and absence of ice has a ramification from the lower trophic levels all the way up to the larger organisms. And this is a modeling activity we're working on using field data, and now it's going in modeling mode with multiple investigators, and to look at the caloric extent. This happens to be the area where we have oil and gas development. So this research has actually been a collaboration of scientists funded by federal government, state government, and the oil company. And we're now working together to build this model so we can try to have some type of evaluation of what we know and where it's going to go forward in the future. And I just would point this out here that if they have to spend more time in the near shore, like haul out on the land, it takes them over 2 weeks they have to spend going out to feed to get the same amount of food that would probably taken them a day if the ice had been residing over there. So these are the evaluations for looking at the predator-prey as well as the impacts of temperature change on the full system. So we started off asking these questions. What do we know about the changing Arctic? Well, we have seasonal interannual changes, but we're looking at those by having coordinated and collaborative and international measurements of standard going on a latitudinal array is one example, looking at the relationship between biology, ocean chemistry, and the sea ice duration, as well as the hydrographic forcing. How can we forecast those? We have the ability, working with physical oceanographers, getting glider measurements, putting moorings in the water, but a lot of biologically, we can put sensors for nutrients. We can have fluorescence on water, also on gliders. but you still need to put the ships out there, and the best way is to put it in a collaborative mode, and so that you can then do multiple operations on one vessel, and we're actually exchanging real-time some of the data between the vessels that are occupying those sites. So what we don't know, we don't know what's going to impact that system with the change in timing. The light comes out about the same time, but if there's no ice, you have more light stability is not there with the sea ice. We have freshwater inflow that tends to make smaller phytoplankton. So that combination has an impact on the carbon cycle. And we still have very little data in the wintertime, and actually coordinated data collections on an observing mode are really what we need to be able to have to understand the carbon cycling and the ecosystem response. And the gaps, the time series data, whether it's by sensors, by satellite, or these time series transect modes, it's the combination, I would say, working interagency. We're doing this through the IRFIC, and also internationally, that provides the strength for this type of study in the area.